It's time for our independent practice. Remember that today's objective is to be able to write a gist for the sections that we read. As we read these next two pages, we'll stop and complete step 1 and step 2 of our thinking steps before you have to write a gist of the 2 pages we read. Let's begin reading. Toward the middle of the 1800s, other adventurous newcomers became part of the westward movement. After arriving in the United States, they traveled on by boat, train, and wagon. They headed for new frontiers in the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. Free land was offered to those who would agree to stay and farm. Norwegians joined other hardy settlers and founded farming communities in places like Minnesota and Wisconsin. Now, before we work on our thinking steps, I want you to take a closer look at this illustration. What do you notice in our illustration here? I don't know about you, but I'm seeing a long line of wagons moving out of the little village that they're in. Now that we've read this page and taken a closer look at the illustration, let's work on our thinking steps. In order to do this, we need to talk about the topic. And when we talk about the topic, we are asking ourselves, who or what are we learning about? Now, I remember reading that about westward movement. That means people were moving west and leaving where they were to move to the west part of the United States. And if you remember back to the photograph here, we are seeing wagons leaving and moving away from where they are. So I know that we are talking about moving west. We see that in our text here as well as our illustration. But now we need to ask ourselves, what about moving west are we learning about? I know that we read that when they moved west, they traveled on by boat, train, and wagon. That means they were moving to the west part of the United States using boats, using trains, or using wagons. We also learn that they were headed for new frontiers. That means new land in places like the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. So that lets me know that we learned that people moved west in boats, trains, and wagons to find new land. Let's keep that in our heads as we read our next page. Soon, other pioneers moved even further west, all the way to California, where Chinese and Mexican immigrants had already settled. These early Chinese settlers helped to build the first transcontinental railroad, and when it was completed in 1869, westward travel increased. The United States had become a vast nation, spreading from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. For more than 200 years, most immigrants had come from Northern Europe and Scandinavia. By the end of the 1800s, more modern steamships had shortened the long transatlantic voyage. People began to arrive in the United States from all over the world in greater numbers. They came from Italy and Poland, Turkey and Greece, Hungary, and Serbia. Now that we've read that page, let's talk about the topic. Remember that when we talk about the topic, we are asking ourselves who or what we are learning about. What we're learning about. And in this section, we learn more about the West. If you take a closer look in our text, we see that pioneers moved even further west. We see the word westward again, so that lets us know we are moving to the west. But what about moving west do we learn? We learn that pioneers moved even further west. They're continuing to move west and explore new parts of the West land. We also read that the United States had become a vast nation. So that means a huge nation spreading from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. That means that now everywhere from one side of the ocean to the other side of the ocean has people living in it. So let's take a closer look at what we learned in both pages. In our first page, we learned that people start to move and settle in the West. And in this last page we just read, we read that pioneers continue to move west. Take a look at both of these things that we learned on both pages. Now, I want you to write a gist using the information from both pages. Remember that a gist is a short retelling of what we read.